So last two webinars, we were discussing the end of life halachas, what people need to be aware of, what halacha considerations we need to have. Then we talked about actual death and what that means and the halachas regarding that. And I want to do a quick, we talked about organ donation, etc. Check out those old videos. They're really good.
They're on YouTube.
They are on YouTube.
On Nicole's YouTube channel.
For today, we'd like to get into really mostly the funeral, what a Jewish funeral is about, what are the practices of a Jewish funeral, what are the customs, what are the laws, as well as Shiva, other things that come up. So without further ado, Raimeth, why don't you give us a little bit of a review of the mysticism of what we're talking about, and then we'll jump into the halacha.
Being the mystic that I am, one of the things we talked about in the previous classes, just to kind of review, is, we talk about in Judaism, we believe in the soul, the neshama. One of the things I always love to quote over is when we talk about the Jewish notion of the soul and the eternity of the soul, I always like to reference the essay written by the great Rabbi Yisrael Salanter when he tries to define what is your soul, a lot of times we think of a soul, it's hard to understand what that is. Like, point to your soul, Rabbi David, it's where is it? Like, it's hard. And Rabbi Salanter argues, and I'm paraphrasing, he calls it Anochi, which means the self or the I. He talks about that your soul, it's not this like monster that's disconnected from you. It's you. It's the guy that's been rooting for the Washington Redskins. It's the guy who likes vanilla more than chocolate. It's
Washington football.
I apologize. Right? It's your essence. It's your personality. It's like when you wake up in the morning and you look in the mirror, that's your soul. Your soul is very real. It's the essence of who you are. And in Judaism, we talk about the idea of that essence, that neshama, that soul, the anochi, as Rabbi Salanter refers to it, it's eternal. That lives on forever. And one of the things we were talking about last week is, when lo aleinu, God forbid, someone dies after 120, and the soul, obviously, there's you'll find in the Rishonim, they talk about death as a pirud, which means a separation. It's obviously a separation of body and soul. The body is no longer, viable. The body is no longer doing what it's supposed to be doing, but the soul is eternal and the soul lasts forever. And one of the things that we were talking about last week and the week before is after death, it's the soul, the self, it has to get used to sort of like a new reality that it's now been disconnected. And yes, the soul goes to heaven and will live on for eternity, but to some degree, and it's hard to know exactly what these things mean. Now, obviously, it's not in the pure physical sense, but in some metaphysical, spiritual realm, the soul still hovers around the body. It's still a certain presence, a certain awareness of its surroundings.
So I would interject and say that the soul certainly does go to heaven and certainly does completely separate from this world. But like you said, not so quickly. Right. And it's actually a process. Step one that needs to happen for the soul to leave the body is a proper halachic burial. That's step one. When the dirt covers the body, that's step one. And the soul is still around to a certain extent during the Shiva period, that we'll get to. And that really, what we were talking about last time, is that really, it explains many of the halachas that we're going to deal with and we've been discussing have to do with honoring the deceased. It's not simply that we look at the body as something which housed this special soul, and therefore that body is a holy thing. It's done so many mitzvahs, done so many great things, but also the person, the anochi that you're discussing, that person is still there, is still present. They know that you're there. And this, I'm going to jump into a quick pet peeve of mine, sure. and then we'll get back onto the outline that we have in front of us here, is when Raimeth and I lived back east, the custom in our, and we lived in different communities, Silver Spring, I lived in upstate in Rochester, New York, and then we both lived in New York City for a while. It's very common in those communities that when someone passes, everyone shows up to the funeral. And when we moved out to Vegas, we found it's a little bit different here. You really have to be close to a person to come to a funeral. Whereas a funeral, first time I came to a funeral here, I was expecting to see 200, 300, 400 people, and there were maybe 24 people. It was a little bit of a shock to me, and especially coming from this perspective that the deceased is there. And the Talmud says it very clearly, black on white, that when you speak at a funeral, realize that the deceased hears every word that you're saying. They're aware of everything that you're saying. And I think it's something that we can work on. I don't like to give rebuke, so I won't, but I'll tell myself, and you can listen. I think what I need to work on is to show up to more funerals. I really think it's an honor that we give to the deceased. And we talk about even the word funeral we discussed earlier today is levaya, actually means to escort. We're escorting this person on their final journey from this earth. And the more people we have doing that, the better. I think the Talmud says that if you have already 600,000 people showing up to a funeral, then you don't have to go, because that's already like a decent showing. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. If it's amounts of people left Egypt, as the Gemara says that, I think I forget what Masach is in, but black and white, if that's enough, but unless the person was a great scholar, in which case there's never enough. So
Yogi Berra once said, if you don't go to people's funerals, they're not going to go to yours. But if you've ever seen, like recently, tragically, the great sage in Israel, Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, at his funeral, I think they said 1 million people were at his funeral. And what's the idea of that? And the idea is this very point, which is it's, going to a funeral. I guess there are several ideas. We're showing support for those who are grieving and the mourners. We want to show our love and support for them. But I think, Rabbi David, to your point, it's showing a certain respect to the deceased, to the nifter, the person who has passed, going and participating. And that's why when a Rabbi Kanievsky passes, you'll have 1 million people will show up. I've been to some of these, mega funerals in Israel of great sages. I'll never forget. I was at Rav Volbe's, if you recall, Rabbi Volbe's funeral. Hundreds of thousands of people. It was, and why are they going? You can't hear anything. You're just there as a way of showing respect to the deceased, because there's this idea of the neshama, the anochi, the awareness that great person had. So I want to kind of be a part of showing that respect. And for everyone else, a loved one, friends, when friends, loved ones pass, the idea of showing up to a funeral, if possible, I think that's where the idea comes from.
Okay, perfect. So that's settled.
We talked about last week, and maybe we'll just touch on it again, Rabbi. So at a funeral in Judaism, the same idea is why we talk about, and one of the things that we always do push is we talk about the proper Jewish burial as opposed to cremation. And again, just the context is because the neshama, because the soul is eternal and it lives on forever. And there is a set of halacha. There is, just like everything in Jewish life, there is a set of law, there's a right, there's a wrong, there's a way to do things. And, we're gonna, last week we talked about burial versus cremation. Moving forward, we'll talk about some of the ideas and customs that relate to the funeral and the Taharas and things like that. But again, it all comes from this acute awareness. The neshama is eternal, and we want to show the respect, the sensitivity for the deceased, and there is a right way to do things. And even if we don't necessarily understand all the details, why this versus that, it will all ultimately fall under the rubric of, well, this is Jewish law. This is, what God said. This is what the Torah says, how we should do things. And, just like when during lifetime we observe mitzvahs because it's the right way to do things, particularly when it comes to death, particularly burial versus cremation. And we won't get into that again, but just as to underline and underscore again the importance of why, and then hit it with the big stick, right? Why it's so important, and that's kind of the idea.
Okay, excellent. So let's just quick transition.
Perfect. That
was kind of a recap of last week and then a little bit of 2 weeks ago. But again, if you missed those, do watch them on YouTube. They're, in my humble opinion, they're really, really good.
And important.
This week, let's focus on the following. So, Rabbi, let's do some role play. You get a phone call. I'll be on this side of the phone. Hey, hi, Rabbi. My great Aunt Harriet is in the hospital. I'm here with her now, and it looks like there's very little time left. So the mood of this webinar is going to get a little more serious now, appropriately. Let's take this seriously. There's very little time left. What do I do?
So being the rabbi answering that phone call, first I would obviously, counsel the person who's calling, it's obviously a traumatic situation. So would deal with the sensitivities of the relative, the loved one dealing with that. The first thing I would do is I would offer to, as a rabbi, as we discussed last week or the week before, the idea of vidoy, saying the prayers with person while they're alive, before they die. I would offer to, drop everything. I'm happy to come to participate, to help say the prayers, with the patient, but that we checked out, what that looked like and all those ideas that we talked about last week. But that would be, I would first manage those types of things. I would then start talking about, let's say now I get the phone call that Aunt Harriet has passed.
I don't have an Aunt Harriet. That's why I gave that example.
Right. So now tragically Aunt Harriet has passed. So what happens now? So there are really three stages when it comes to dealing with the death of a loved one. There is going to be, there are really multiple stages, but immediately what's going to happen is there's the Tahara process. There is the essentially transporting the deceased, the niftar, the deceased, transporting them from wherever they were, whether it be in a house or a medical facility, transferring them to the funeral home, where the funeral home will then take care of the deceased, of the body. That's the Tahara process. We're then going to talk about the funeral, and then number three, the burial. Step four is going to be after the burial. So those kind of are the stages. Steps 1, 2, and 3, which are again the dealing with the body, the funeral, and then the burial. In a certain sense, the funeral home is going to be the point. They're going to be the ones that are going to be dealing with making the phone calls, who's going to be picking up the deceased, where are they going to be going? They're going to be doing a lot of the nitty gritty. I
want to throw in a quick plug here for any amount of pre-planning that a person can do is really, really important. None of us like to really think about these things or deal with these things, but any amount of pre-planning, and then of course, informing our loved ones of what our plans were. First of all, God forbid, we don't want to be a financial burden on someone who has to deal with all these costs. We don't want a person to have them make their own judgment call. God forbid a person is dying or is now dead, and now their spouse has to start thinking, okay, which do I want them to be buried in Israel? Do I want them to be buried next to their parents back in Philadelphia? I want them to be buried in Las Vegas? We don't want to have to deal with those kind of questions. These are things that we should give a gift to our loved ones, is dealing with these on the front end so they don't have to make these difficult decisions.
And as a rabbi, I can tell you, I've seen both situations. So for example, when my dad passed, he had made all the arrangements in advance. It was just making a bunch of phone calls, and it really there was very few logistics that needed to be dealt with. I've been in many situations where there were no pre-plans that were arranged, and it's not like it's impossible. You just have to make a lot of phone calls and arrangements, and it's just a layer of stress and complication, which you can navigate. It's not like rocket science. It can be navigated, but it's in the context of grieving and a lot of emotions, and it could be very stressful, and it is there's no way around it. There is a financial element to it. So it's just one layer that if it could be avoided, it should be noted. Rabbi, there is, I'll never forget, my parents years ago, they came over to me, they said, Nahum, we're investing in real estate in Israel. And I'm like, what are you talking? My parents said, they're not real estate people at all. And I'm like, oh, they had bought plots in Israel, and they had made those, arrangements in advance. There's actually, if I recall correctly, it's considered a merit, a zechus, to living a long life for a person to take care of their final arrangements in advance. I think the idea, I believe the idea is that it's a chesed, it's an act of kindness, correct, so that the next generation, the next of kin, won't have to deal with all those stresses. I've taken care of those in advance. So it's definitely a good thing if a person is in the position to deal with these kinds of things in advance. It's definitely a good idea. It's a little macabre, it's a little morbid, but we're mortal, and view it as a zechus, as a merit to living a long life.
And along with the theme we've been talking about the last two webinars, this is again where you reach out to a rabbi that you trust and talk about what you want to do with them.
Right.
Get their input and say, we'd like to use this funeral home. The rabbi will tell you, oh, that's a funeral home that's very, halachically compliant, and they'll give you a great experience. Or this one, not so much. This is more complicated. Another issue which will come up, and this will have to do with transporting a body to Israel. There's an idea that in order to honor the deceased, and then we mentioned the soul doesn't leave the deceased until they're properly buried. Well, how long is it going to take between the time that a person passes and the actual burial? Again, these are all factors that need to be discussed. The short answer is the shorter, the better. I think in Israel, the custom is that day.
Yeah, they will be. It's actually very creepy. Have you ever been to a funeral in Jerusalem?
I have, yes.
Have you ever been to a funeral in Jerusalem at night?
No.
That is creepy. In Jerusalem, they are particularly, most places out of Jerusalem, I think, funerals are not done at night in Jerusalem. And maybe let's talk about this now. I mean, you really hit on it, Rabbi, there is a concept in Judaism of we bury the dead because it's a sign of respect. There's something called kavod hames, the respect for the dead. We try to do the burial as soon as practical. But, Rabbi, as you pointed out, in Jerusalem, it's like that day. Absolutely, they want to get that the burial happening that day, really as best as can. They will do funerals at night. My dad's, I'm sorry, going back to my dad a lot, but that experience, that was a funeral at night. It was kind of creepy, but that's what happens. So when we talk about, so what happens when you get that call, Aunt Harriet has passed. So a good idea is make sure you have a rabbi that you trust who can help be involved, because there is a little bit of like a triangular or even more relationship. You're going to have the grieving family. You're going to then be, the funeral home are really going to be the ones who are going to be dealing with a lot of the real logistics, transporting the body, arranging the Tahara, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, dealing with when and where will the funeral be and how is that going to look? What about the burial? The funeral home is going to usually be very involved on the real logistics of that.
I can't tell you how proud I am of Roy Meth for not calling them the quarterback. I know you've been resisting it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, I didn't know. So they'll be the quarterbacking that, man. And what you really want is just, you're going to want to have a rabbi just to make sure that things are being done in accordance with Jewish custom and law. I know, Rabbi, when we were talking about, with the role of the funeral home, they're not necessarily, they're not bad people. They're good people. They're doing their jobs, but
they may not have the same sensitivities that we might have,
right?
That you listening or us speaking or the Torah is going to have. They're not that. Their goal is to do this in a way that's expedient for their business. Our goal is to do this in a way that's complies with halacha,
right,
and is which means respectful, to the dead and what's most comfortable for the family. So making sure that you have an advocate in your corner who has navigated this before. And that's where the rabbi comes in.
Right. And I should underscore, usually there aren't like major points of friction or tension. I don't want to like give off that impression that in these stuff, there's like a big push. That's not what's happening. Usually everyone's very, very sensitive and respectful, but a lot of the funeral homes, especially here locally in Las Vegas, they're wonderful. They're doing their jobs, but they might not they're doing their jobs. They're not rabbis who necessarily have their eye on making sure this is done in the most, halachically compliant way. So the funeral home, you'll be in touch with the funeral home and the rabbi.
Let's actually walk through it. So
let's
the
walk
funeral
through.
They're going to pick up the deceased.
And they'll pick up the deceased. But before they even do that, you're going to get on the phone with the rabbi and the funeral home, and the rabbi will triangulate with the funeral home, and you'll tell them, hey, Aunt Harriet, we want to do a proper halachic Jewish funeral, including the burial, as well as what's called a Tahara. If you're not familiar with the word Tahara, Tahara literally means purification. It is the way we prepare the deceased for the burial. So it's the transfer and the preparation of the deceased for the burial. So you want to tell the funeral.
And I just want to throw in some jargon here. We'll hear the words Chevra Kaddisha.
Yes.
Literally, Chevra Kaddisha means the holy society. Those are the people who actually will take care of the Tahara. And that's always volunteers. No one ever gets paid for that. And that's a chesed shel emes. That's the ultimate kindness that they would do. And they're going to be washing the body. They're going to be putting on the special burial shrouds that we're going to wear. And again, it's not a Jewish custom for someone says, I want to be buried in my tuxedo. Because we don't really do that. So really, we're supposed to be buried in our burial shrouds the way we have been for since time eternal. The idea is that the person who's buried in these white shrouds looks like the Kohen Gadol, looks like the high priest, the way the high priest would look when he enters the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur.
And the way it works is, at least here in Vegas, but I think in most communities as well, is the funeral home, you just tell them, hey, we want a Tahara. You're not going to need to be in touch with the Chevra Kaddish, the Jewish Burial Society. The funeral home knows what that, assuming you're using one of the local Jewish affiliated funeral homes, they'll know what to do. They know who to call. You don't have to worry about, is the Chevra Kadisha doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Right.
You don't have to be concerned about that. Both the funeral home and the rabbi, who again, you should be in touch with, who's just going to help triangulate, will just make sure that all of those things are happening. The preparation of the deceased for the burial, as the rabbi pointed out, the shrouds that we put the mace, we put the deceased into, the washing of the body. There's a certain procedure that's all based on Jewish law and halacha that will happen and take place, before the funeral.
So let's jump down to the next step. So the mace that we'll say the mace, literally in Hebrew, that means deceased. The deceased, it's in a more gentler way than saying the body. Right. The mace, the deceased will be picked up. They'll be brought to the funeral home. That's where the Tahara will take place. And then the loved ones will show up, hopefully the next morning, because we want this as quickly as possible for the burial. At that point, they will see their deceased loved one. Well, they won't actually see them. We'll get to that in a second. In the simplest wooden box that can be made. Really, if we go to Israel, it's an interesting thing. The first time I was there for a funeral was jarring. It was my grandmother, actually. And in Israel, they do not bury in boxes. There are no coffins. The body of the deceased is wrapped in the burial shroud, so you can't see the body at all. But it is the form of a body. Yeah. And that being, I'm sorry to do this like this, but that being my grandmother was actually very, very distressing for me to see. I knew it, but I wasn't expecting it. So
be forewarned, if you go to a funeral in Israel, there is no coffin. The mace, the deceased, again, totally wrapped. If it's a man, there'll be a talus, right. But you can clearly see there's the form of a person. And
where does this come from? The Torah says that you came from the earth and you shall return to the earth. You didn't come in a box. You don't leave in a box. As we go right into the earth. That's the idea. So because in America, we don't do that, but we do want to be as simple as possible. We want something which is going to break down. Someone is buried in a metal, or other, enamel kind of coffin that completely defeats the purpose of a burial in the ground. And one thing that, again, we don't do is, we were discussing this earlier today, is any kind of open casket or wake or anything like that.
Yeah, that's not in accordance to Jewish law. And as a matter of fact, I think it's usually considered, that's almost like a form of disrespect. That's not kavod hames. That's not honoring the deceased. So open caskets, open coffins, that's not done. So that's sort of stage one, is the preparation of the mace, the preparation of the body. I'm
going to throw my own 2 cents there just for a second. Please. I really think that when we think about a wake, I'm imagining like someone who goes to a wake where you have like a sitting president. I'm not a sitting president now.
And no longer.
Unfortunately, he's no longer a sitting president. Yeah. So when that happens, and we look at that person with makeup and stuffing cotton in their mouths, whatever it takes to make them look like they're still alive and healthy, it really emphasizes the physicality of that person.
Right.
Where from our perspective, it's exactly the opposite. The physicality of the person is the least important part of them. It's their soul, and that soul is going to be processed properly. I'm sorry to use a tough word called process, but processed properly in the proper burial shrouds in the ground as quickly as possible, so that soul can go to where it's supposed to go, where, going back to class number 1, where it's been intended to go since the beginning of its relatively short journey in this world.
So that's stage 1 of the Tahara, the preparation of the body for the funeral, which brings us to stage 2, which is, what does a Jewish funeral look like? So we'll take a few moments. Rabbi, why don't you lead us or start the conversation? What does a Jewish funeral look like?
Typically what's going to happen is we're going to go, well, there's really 2 things you can do. There could be a graveside funeral, which is sometimes done, for financial considerations. It's cheaper than having a chapel. Sometimes that's just what the family wants. But either way, what's going to happen is the funeral will happen in the presence of the deceased. So the coffin will be there. And the rabbi who's officiating the funeral is going to start with a few Psalms of Tehillim, which are, it's not simply to create this Tehillim, of course, Psalms, not simply to create a mood, although it does, but it's said in the merit of the deceased. When those of us who are in attending his funeral, and that gets back to the idea of more people attending the funeral, the better. When we're attending the funeral and we're saying those Psalms, we're listening to the lesson of those Psalms, we're creating zechusim, which means merits that will accrue to the deceased. That's going to be step number one. Step number two will be the eulogies. The eulogies will be, it can be given by the rabbi, family members. Really, it's the more the merrier. And the eulogies should focus really on two things. Right, Matt, why don't you tell us what the two things are? It is a test because we didn't practice this before.
Let's see, the two things. Well, why don't you take it? I'm curious.
Well, the truth is I just made this up. So
yeah, I don't know.
So the two things are number one is to honor the deceased.
Okay.
Like we were saying, is that number one is that we want this deceased to hear how much we love them, how much we appreciate them, how much they meant to us. So in that sense, we want as many as the family members. Not everyone's comfortable getting up speaking, which is okay. But if we are comfortable getting up, sharing our emotions, we'll get to this idea of dealing with emotions a little bit later on, sharing our emotions, sharing our love, that is a beautiful way to honor the deceased. So that honors the deceased. It also, by the way, helps those loved ones really feel that validation of everyone being there to hear their sorrow and knowing that everyone cares about them. That's number one. Number two, it's to inspire others. We're going to say things that are inspirational about that person. So if this person, for example, they were great balei chesed, they always did kind things for people, they were always spoke nicely to other people, then we're going to extol those virtues. We're going to talk about that with the hope that that inspires people who come to the funeral. Our sages teach us that it's better to go to a funeral than to go to a party. Why? Because if we go to a party, we'll have a drink, we'll have some food, we'll dance, and then we leave. If we go to a funeral, we learn something, we leave motivated.
I don't know about you, but whenever I go to a funeral, I always walk away. I don't mean this in a morbid sense. I always do walk away a little bit more inspired. I get home, I hug my kids a little bit, with a little bit more tenderness, with a little bit more. And I've been inspired. I still remember to this day funerals of friends' parents from like 20 years ago that resonated. And like I didn't know the mace. I didn't know the person who had passed. But the eulogy was very inspiring, and I did walk away. To your 2 points, I walked away inspired. And I really did feel like I was a better person. Rabbi, if I could just hop in, a common challenge, not a common, hopefully not too common, but a challenge that does come up every now and again is if, let's say, a loved one, immediate family member, a child, loses a parent, and let's say we're in a situation where there was some tension in the family, and which is, it's reality that sometimes happens. I want to just flag, a eulogy and a funeral is not the place to air those grievances. It's, because of those 2 points that you brought out, not to invalidate. If there was real tension in that relationship, that's going to be something that, the child moving forward, now that their parent is gone, is going to have to work that through. And that's a very real, emotional element. But when one speaks, especially at a funeral, because of this idea, Rabbi, those 2 points and that general sense of the anochi, that the soul is still there, I think it's specifically considered very harmful / disrespectful, to say things that are negative, to bring out. And in any relationship, there's going to be challenges and tensions. The funeral and the eulogies at the funeral is not the place to talk about them. If there was tension, if there were points of disagreement or friction, talk about the good things and ignore the bad things.
There'll be a time. There'll be a time for that. I want to throw one more piece in, and then we actually left something out I want to come back to.
Okay.
So one more piece is there's also a custom at that moment to ask forgiveness from the deceased. If it's someone that I love, specifically, I guess whether they were sick for a long time or not, and maybe we didn't handle everything appropriately, or maybe we never had a chance to, apologize to our parents for not necessarily always being the best kids. That's a time very personally that we go up to the grave before the caskets, because all of this is before the caskets lower in the grave, whether we're in the chapel or we're outside. And that's when we really talk to the deceased. They're not going to say anything back to us, but we do understand that they're there and they're listening, and we want to have a chance to air that. So the one piece that I missed, that was actually the most important piece, is the idea of tearing kriya.
Yes.
So Rabbi, why don't you take that away?
I'll share just a personal story. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Israel with my son Isaac celebrating his bar mitzvah 2 years late, but COVID didn't allow us to get to Israel on time. And so we went to Israel and we went to visit the wall, the Kotel, the Western Wall. Now, many people are unaware, but there is, the Kotel, which is obviously or naturally one of the most significant places in all of Judaism, but to some degree, it represents a place of sorrow as well, because after all, it highlights the fact that the temple—
It's only the Kotel.
It's only the Kotel, the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, the Beit HaMikdash still lays in ruin. And it's actually considered a place where we're actually supposed to grieve the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. And the halacha, which I don't know why it's not so well practiced, but the halacha, it's a very clear halacha, it's an unambiguous halacha, is a person is supposed to, if they haven't been to the Kotel, haven't seen the ruins of the temple in 30 days or whatever it may be, a significant amount of time, the halacha is a person needs to tear kriya. So what is tearing kriya? Tearing kriya is usually something that we do at a funeral, an immediate family member of the deceased. So you're talking about a child, a parent, God forbid, or a sibling or spouse of the deceased will tear their garments. Now, how you do it, where you do it, it depends. The child does it one way, the sibling does it a different way, but the garment is actually rend. It's you tear one's garment. I think the idea is we were talking about last week or 2 weeks ago. The idea in Judaism is we mourn and we grieve. We don't overly mourn and overly grieve. We don't, we were talking about making cuts on one's body as a sign of grief. That we don't do, but emotion.
We do cut our clothing.
We do cut our clothing. Emotion needs expression. And the Torah, it's really a Torah requirement, recognizes that. And the Torah requires a way of sort of expressing the grief and sorrow is to tear one's shirt or one's jacket or both, for that matter, depending on the situation.
Okay,
and
I'm going to air some pet peeves.
Yes,
that's in my theme tonight.
Before you do that, let me just finish the story. So the halacha, the rule is let me go back to the Kotel story. At the Kotel, you're supposed to do that. It's that significant as the tragedy of the temple. So when I went to Israel, I just went for a week, and I went with my son Isaac. And we decided we're going to go, and we were going to be doing a lot of traveling while we were there. So we really packed very lightly. We didn't check anything. It was only, carry on, because we didn't have any time. I didn't want to be waiting in airports and carrying luggage. So we had a very small amount of clothing. And we both made a point, we wanted to do the kriya to tear our shirts at the wall. So I had to pack an extra shirt. You obviously don't want to do the nicest of shirts because it's a one-time, although you can rip your shirt twice if you want, but that's a technical point. We both brought extra shirts. We brought extra shirts so that when we got to the Kotel, we tore the kriya. And it was actually a beautiful moment to share with my son, when we literally tore our shirts in front of the Kotel as a sign of grief. It made it very real. There was something, and our sages tell us that's the point of it. It made it very real. It was like very powerful
giving
experience.
An emotion and expression.
It was a very powerful experience.
Okay, can I air my grievances now?
Please, Rabbi.
Okay,
that's what we're here for.
Okay, so here's my grievance. So I come to Las Vegas 13 years ago or so, and pretty soon after, unfortunately, I'm doing a funeral. And the fellow who's running the funeral from the funeral home, this was actually a military funeral and not one of the regular, I guess, Jewishly sensitive funeral homes. And he says, "Okay, Rabbi, where would you like me to put these ribbons?"
The ribbons.
I'm like, "What ribbons?" He says, "The ribbons," and he shows me these black ribbons, like something like they're black, so it wouldn't feel like you won first place in like a baking contest because it's black. Well, otherwise, that's what it'd be. And I'm like, "I don't even know what these are." And he says, "Well, these are for tearing." I'm like, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, yeah, the way we do it around here is that we don't tear our clothes. That would be too traumatic. Instead, we place a little ribbon and we tear the ribbon."
Right.
Again, I always go back to my mom or my grandma when I think about times like this. This one, I'll go to my grandmother because she's way tougher than my mom. If she saw me tearing a ribbon because she died and I didn't want to waste the jacket, I think she would come out of her grave and give me a piece of her mind. right?
Yeah.
When we lose a loved one, now again, the tearing of a garment is only for the immediate relatives. If you're going to a friend's funeral, you're
Right.
going to a cousin's funeral, you're going to your uncle's funeral, you don't tear. It's only for the immediate nuclear family. That's who tears these garments. And yet, interesting side note, a person's primary rabbi also
Yeah.
one would
Yeah.
tear their garments, because again, we feel that the Torah creates such a powerful connection. But again, it's such a powerful moment to really express that, and in my mind, to kind of make that more, chill, parav, less, more, what's the word I'm looking for?
Sterile. Or like,
I'm not going to rip my jacket. I'll rip this little ribbon.
Yeah.
I really.
Yeah. I do encourage.
I don't love that.
Yeah, I do encourage the tearing of the kriya. Like I remember, when we were going to visit to the Kotel, so I reached out to a rabbi, and I someone I trust. I was asking, like, why, a lot of people don't tear the kriya when they go to the wall. And I asked him, is there a reason? He said, yeah, there are reasons why there are certain leniencies people rely on. And then he said, but you know what? The temple is worth a shirt.
Yep.
And it's
100%.
true. And with a loved one as well, this is the proper way to mourn and grieve. If it's just expensive or a little, it's not even awkward. It's really not. It's the cost of a shirt,
And it's
really
a
not.
sign. And you told me an interesting story this morning
Oh.
about sitting in the airport.
Oh, I can't tell you how powerful of a story this was. After my dad had passed, he was buried in Israel, and it was a whirlwind. He passed, he got on an airplane, you go to Israel, he was buried in, the outskirts of Jerusalem. I slept at my aunt and uncle's house, and I got right back on a plane. I wasn't even in Israel for not even 18 hours, in and out. And I got back on the airplane. I'm in Ben Gurion Airport at the gate. I'm with, two of my siblings. And as we're going to see in a few moments, there's a tradition, when you're a mourner, you sit on the floor, you don't sit on a seat. So the three of us were kind of like sitting at the gate at the floor, but all three of us, we were clearly wearing ripped, garments. My suit jacket was ripped, my shirt was ripped. So was my brother's, my sister. And we were just kind of three of us, sitting there. It happens to be, that flight was a very therapeutic flight, the three of us sharing memories. But I will never, ever forget sitting on the floor in Ben Gurion Airport with my torn jacket. And if you know, if you're a passerby, you know exactly what's happening. This is Israel. You know exactly what was going on. And I want to say 50, if not 100 people came over to us and wishing the words of consolation, which, we'll mention now. There's a tradition when you see someone mourning, you say there's a special prayer that you recite, and 150 random people came over to us, offering us that prayer of consolation. I don't know who these people were. I will never see them again, in all likelihood. It was all because we had that kriya. It was very clear what was happening. It was so powerful. And I personally, I know my siblings as well, we drew a ton of strength. I felt very Jewish,
You feel like you're part of a family, which you are. So let's move on now. So we've covered the kriya, which means the tearing. We've covered the Tehillah and the Psalms. We've covered the eulogy and the 2 points of the eulogy. And now we've asked forgiveness from the deceased. And now we're actually going to bury the person.
Before we bury the person, there's one small step in between, which is actually, in a way, the Hebrew word for a funeral is levaya. Levaya means to escort. So usually it's either to the funeral home or from the funeral home to the burial, to the cemetery. We actually will, levaya means to escort. We will follow the coffin, or the mace, the deceased, to the cemetery. And everyone, that's a very significant part of the funeral, is everyone to follow behind in a procession to the cemetery. And now we get to the burial.
Correct.
So what happens at a burial? So again, there are a couple.
Let me start with what doesn't happen.
Yes.
That was one of your points. Here's what doesn't happen. What doesn't happen at a proper Jewish burial is that the casket is left there and out of the ground, and everyone leaves and goes to a restaurant.
Right.
The reason why that doesn't happen is because, again, we believe that the deceased is still there. until that deceased is properly buried, he's still there or she is still there. We never walk away at that point. That's the point that we're really focusing on burying this person and doing so as much as we can with our bare hands.
Yeah.
It's the most respectful thing to do is to lower the casket into the grave by hand. Now, obviously you have some pulleys because it wouldn't be practical to do it by hand, to shovel dirt into the ground by hand. And, if possible, we ask the truck that has the dirt to leave all the dirt next to the grave. And then everyone who's at the funeral, if you're physically able to, you come and you put a few shovels into the ground. It's again, you're in a very meaningful way. You're not, when we're going through something difficult, the most painful thing is to be ignored.
Yeah.
If any one of my kids so much as skins one hair off of their knee, what they need is everyone in the family to know exactly what happened, every detail, and to sit around and look at them compassionately with empathy.
Right.
If God forbid a kid skins their knee and nobody cares, it's and now I'm being serious. It's a tragedy. It's a tragic loss of love in that family. If a person is laying in the ground, they're being put into the ground for their final ending their journey in this world, and we don't really focus on it and address it and come right up to the grave and think words in our mind of, I'm going to miss you. I want to do one final mitzvah, one final way to say goodbye. That is leaving the person who passed. It's leaving them alone. We never want to have that emotion for ourselves or for them.
And it's, whenever I'm in these situations as a rabbi, when I'm officiating a funeral, I will always mention this idea to the family that yes, naturally, many people are a little traumatized with the idea of having to lower the coffin or casket into the ground and then being involved in actually filling it up with dirt. It looks so harsh or painful or gross, or whatever that emotional hesitation is, but even building on what you were saying, Rabbi, is you'll find in the Talmud, they talk about burying the dead. Often they'll use the terminology as chesed shel emes, the kindness of truth. And I believe the way it's explained is whenever we do a kindness, let's say Rabbi Davidowitz calls me up and says, hey, Rabbi, do you have jumper cables? My battery's dead. And I say, sure, Rabbi, no problem. I'll swing by and I jump Rabbi Davidowitz's car. So it's an act of kindness. It's called a chesed. So anytime, because we are human, no matter how, much I care for Rabbi Davidowitz and how genuine a kindness it was, our humanity mandates that in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I wonder how Rabbi Davidowitz is going to pay me back.
There's an agenda.
There's always an agenda, not in a devious, manipulative way, but it's actually it's a good part of humanity is we like to reciprocate. We like to go ahead and say thank you to people, when they do us a kindness. So if I do a kindness to someone else, not that I'm expecting a thank you, but because that's just the nature of humanity, there's the being thanked or the reciprocation element is always going to be there. When it comes to burying the dead, someone who we love, a family member, a friend, it's a chesed shel emes, it's a kindness of truth, because we know they're never going to be able to pay us back in a physical kind of way.
Correct. Goes back to Yogi Berra.
It goes back to Yogi Berra. And that's why I think, if anything, even though it might be a little traumatic to some, in a certain element, it's the greatest kindness. It's the greatest thing that we can do to our loved one. I want to be the one to bury. I'm not going to let it be done by some workers to push a button. I want to be the one to get that mitzvah of showing that kindness to my loved one. And that's why, as best as possible, the grave really should be filled up. Now, out here, sometimes it's not practical. So, they'll have the truck will fill it up with dirt, but certainly as much as possible, if not the entire grave really should be filled, manually.
Yeah. Well, just one last point on that. If someone practically really can't do it, they really are not comfortable, we're not suggesting that you do it, but right. We are suggesting that to the extent that we can be very upfront and very clear with our emotions. To that extent, we let those emotions out, and then we can walk away, and we really do have a closure. If I'm the kind of person who it's traumatic for me to see the body go into the ground, it's probably also traumatic to walk away, never have seen the body going into the ground,
Right.
yet knowing that it's there. To the extent that we can deal with our emotions on the front end, we'll have less emotional baggage on the back end. So I want to quickly transition because we're already late. So the body has been buried. There's one more prayer that we say, which we don't need to get into right now. It's called Tzedek Hadin. Our goal here, we meant to say this as a disclaimer before, is not to give an exhaustive list of everything that has to be done, but more to give an understanding of how the whole system works. An overview is a great word. Is now we have the Shura. So the body has been buried, and now the Shura. Rabbi, take us.
So the Shura literally means a row or a column after the burial, and so we now transition. We've done the Tahara, we've taken care of the mace of the deceased. We've done the funeral and the eulogies, and we finished the kfura. We finished the burial. We now transition the mourners, the immediate loved family members of the deceased. They now will transition into the Shiva period, the 7 days of mourning, and the way they transition from the burial to the Shiva, which is that fourth stage, is we do the Shura. After the burial, what happens is the men will line up on one side, create like a row, women will create another row, and the mourners will walk between the men and women, and they will walk at that point. There's a tradition during the Shiva, during the period of mourning, they at that point should be not wearing leather shoes. They should be wearing their ripped garments, and they walk between the community, who then recites the prayer of comfort, which in Hebrew is Hamakom Yenachem Eschem Besoch Shar Avelei Tzion B'Yerushalayim, which translates that God should comfort you amongst the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. And that's the traditional prayer of comfort, and that is sort of the transition. The Shura is the transition ceremony or ritual that transitions the mourners from the burial. Now they're called Avelim. Up to that point, they were in a status called Onanim, which is a very intense form of mourning. They've now transitioned, and they are now Avelim. They are now proper mourners in the Shiva period, which I guess segues to the final step.
Well, before you segue,
we're not going to segue just yet.
No, we could segue, but I want to give you a compliment first. I love your tie. First
Thank you.
Another compliment I wanted to say is that I love the word transition that you said, because there's a halacha that says, a law that says that we do not attempt to comfort the mourners when the dead body is in front of them. During the funeral, our job is not to comfort the mourners. It's to be there for them.
Right.
It's to show solidarity. It's to show that we care, but it's not to offer words of comfort. When the burial's over, that Shiva period is a transition. Now we're offering words of comfort. And I think that Shua really, the word transition is really perfect, because that we switch from that status that we call Onain to what we call an Avel, which is Avelos. We've heard those words before. And that's when our goal is, again, to help the people who are mourning experience their loss, and also be comforted by the fact that their loved one meant something to us, is that simply we're just present. We know that they're suffering, and we're here to suffer with them.
Following the Shura, the mourners, which are again spouse, children, parents, siblings of the deceased, will then begin the Shiva period, which is 7 days, including the funeral. How you calculate those days, have a rabbi to help you out, exactly when the Shiva begins, when it ends, and all this and that. But it begins functionally a 7-day period of mourning. After the Shura, the mourners go to wherever they are going to be sitting Shiva, wherever they're going to be participating in the Shiva. The first thing that happens when they get into that Shiva house, when they're going to be doing Shiva, is it's called a Sudas Havra. There should be a meal of consolation. There's a lot of confusion about what this meal looks like. It's not like supposed to be this big celebration. It's not supposed to be a party, a buffet. It really comes from, based on Kabbalistic or other teachings, the first meal that the mourners eat after the burial should be food that's prepared by somebody else, not in their house, based on Talmudic reasons and other reasons. Someone needs to bring them food, and that's supposed to be a way. But Talmud says that's part of the Shiva process. There's a lot of confusion based on that. I think, this is my theory, is because there is this idea of the Sudas Havra, the first meal that the mourners, when they get to their house, someone should bring It's usually a hard-boiled egg, a piece of bread, something very, very simple. It should be brought from the outside into the house of the morning. I think it's like a very American thing. That's a bit of confusion. People think that what do you do at a Shiva house? I don't know if you've ever seen this at Shiva houses. You think what you do at a Shiva house for the next 7 days is you're supposed to bring food to the mourners. That's not a thing, to the best of my knowledge.
Right.
I mean, it's nice. I think it's beautiful that the community should be taking care of the mourners so that they don't have to worry and
they shouldn't be
distracted. But I remember when I was sitting Shiva, like people just brought an incredible amount of food. I mean, it was great, and I gained a couple pounds. But you will see that there's nothing wrong about it, but it's not like a thing that you need to do.
I think where maybe it is not really right is that it's not a party. And like I've seen,
right.
I'm remembering again attending someone's Shiva house, not very religious, and there were 2 catering trucks outside.
Right. That's not
what we're looking for.
That's not really
we want to be supportive, of the people who are mourning, and that's bringing them breakfast, lunch, and dinner is a beautiful thing to do.
It is, yeah.
But it's not a party, and it's not supposed to be.
In many communities, what happens is it's not for religious reasons, but or even tradition. But it's like Rabbi, as you said, so as not to be a distraction to the mourners, someone will usually arrange breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and the community people will pitch in. But the idea is not like it's not a bar mitzvah, it's not a wedding. Like you don't need, cake, bagels, and lox. You don't need to do any of that.
Right.
During the Shiva period, maybe let's now talk about some of the traditions,
yes.
some of the more fundamental. And again, there are many, many, many rules and rituals and laws and customs. And now is not really the place to go through it. And please God, or God forbid, if this ever becomes relevant, again, have someone who you can consult with. But just as a general overview, some of the key. Let's go through some of the key.
I think a nice way to do this is let's think Tisha B'Av.
Let's think Tisha B'Av.
If we don't know the laws of Tisha B'Av, then listen now and you'll know the laws of Tisha B'Av. There's no sitting on regular chairs. The mourners are going to sit on the floor. They don't wear leather shoes. You can eat. You can eat. There is no regular bathing. We could discuss that as it becomes relevant. They're still going to be wearing those clothing that are ripped or a different clothing.
You should be wearing the ripped clothing. Yeah.
There's also, you've heard of a Shiva minyan, an Avel minyan. There is a great custom that we hold as many as 3 minyans a day in the home of the mourners, where the mourners have opportunity to say Kaddish, because again, they're not supposed to leave their house.
If it's not, I should just highlight, if it's not feasible to arrange for a minyan 3 times a day in the mourners' houses, the mourners are permitted and in fact encouraged. They should go to a minyan. They should go to a shul. They are allowed to leave their house to go and participate with a minyan, and indeed they should to participate.
Right. Which is a great transition to Kaddish, Rabbi.
One of the things that is, heavily associated with mourning in Judaism is Kaddish. Rabbi, I need to say a Kaddish. And one of the questions, Rabbi, I don't know if I get it all the time with a mourner, is that they want to say the Kaddish. They've been told that's what mourners do. That's the prayer that we recite as mourners. We recite the Kaddish. It's the memorial prayer. And indeed, when it's written in its Hebrew lettering, but the actual language is not even Hebrew; it's Aramaic. So it's a little bit of a difficult language. Every now and again, you'll get a mourner will read the Kaddish in English, and they'll say, "Rabbi, why exactly are we reciting Kaddish? There's nothing about my loved one. It's not a memorial prayer at all. There is no reference to yizk, to remembrance, to memorials. It's intuitively, it's not a memorial prayer. So the question is, why do we recite Kaddish? Why is Kaddish the important prayer that's recited? You want to handle it? I'll take it. One of the things, kind of going back to where we started this whole, webinar series, the point of life, God puts us on this world to do what's right and avoid what's wrong as defined by the Torah, because our souls, which live on forever, it's really in the world to come. That's where it enjoys the satisfaction of all the good choices that we've made and has to deal with all the consequences of the not such good choices that we've made. The point of this world is to do as many mitzvahs as we can, is to grow spiritually. The problem or the challenge is that we're on a clock. There's a football game, and when that game clock hits, quadruple zero, we can't do any more mitzvahs anymore. We're out of time. While we're in this world, we do as many mitzvahs as we can as a way of rising higher and higher in heaven. And once we're gone, we're gone. And that's it. We're kind of static at that point. There's one exception. There's one exception. If during our lifetime or during our loved ones' lifetimes, they've inspired others to do more mitzvahs. If someone has inspired me to try to do a little bit more, and now I go ahead and I do a mitzvah because that person has inspired me
Or enabled.
Me to do a mitzvah. So now that person, to some degree, is kind of credited, it's an investment in that person's lifetime by inspiring me. So now when I go ahead and I do a mitzvah, they to some degree get credited to being an enabler, to helping facilitate, the mitzvahs that I've accomplished. That's really fundamentally the idea of Kaddish. If you ever look at Kaddish, what is Kaddish? Kaddish is a public declaration of my belief in Judaism. It's an affirmation of our Judaism, and it's a public affirmation. Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabbah. May the great name of God be exalted. In this world, which he created according to his design, he's going to rule, in his kingdom. And we go ahead and we say, Yehei Shnei Rabba Mevarach, may God's name be, be blessed, forever and ever. When we go ahead and we proclaim and affirm our fundamental belief in Judaism, and we don't just do that privately, we do that in a minyan, we gather in front of the community and we publicly proclaim our affirmation of our belief. And when we're reciting that Kaddish, we're saying, why am I affirming my belief in Judaism? Why am I reciting this prayer? It's because my loved one inspired me. Their memory is what's motivating me to come here and affirm my Judaism publicly. Well, that is the greatest way that mitzvah that I'm doing now, to some degree, will get credited back, to my loved one. And that's fundamentally the idea of the Kaddish. It's not so much a memorial prayer. There are memorial prayers in Judaism. There's Yizkar, which is recited at certain ideas. Even Yizkar, if you read Yizkar, it's not just a memorial prayer. We talk about the main idea of Yizkar is we pledge to give money to charity because we're motivated by the life and inspiration of the loved one who came before me. The idea is we're doing mitzvahs of any sort because of the inspiration that loved one, instilled within me. That's the idea.
Okay, I want to take one more quick segue because I think you've set us up perfectly for the Yahrzeit, which is of course the anniversary and then the subsequent anniversaries forever. The Yahrzeit, it's not simply a celebration. Right. It's not a commemoration. Is once a person is deceased, and they're no longer in this world, they've been properly buried, their soul has lived through in this world a long life, 120 years, the burial, the Shiva, the Shloshim, it is now passed on completely into the realm of the spiritual. They don't need your celebration, they don't need your affirmation. The Yahrzeit is an opportunity to again say Kaddish for them, to again do a mitzvah or multiple mitzvahs in their merit, in their memory. And it's not a game because I, who ultimately came from them, from my parents and my grandparents and their parents before them, I am doing mitzvahs, whether it's learning Torah, doing chesed, whatever mitzvah I'm going to do, that mitzvah is going to be in their memory. And really based on that, we don't need to limit this just simply to a Yahrzeit. Anytime we can do something that it's in memory of our parents, any kind of mitzvah that, or grandparents, whoever it is, that is an exceptionally amazing gift that we can give to them that literally lives on eternally. It's not celebrating a legacy. We're actually creating something spiritual for ourselves and for them as well.
And maybe we'll just end with the idea, one of the projects that we've tried that we've launched at the Kola, we call it the Yahrzeit project, is a lot of times people struggle with the Yahrzeit. You want to do something, but maybe aren't so sure, aren't so clear, not so comfortable saying Kaddish. And what we try to do is, the idea is, building on what you, Rabbi, what you were just pointing out, the idea is at any point, the Yahrzeit is just a way of highlighting, but if at any point a person feels like, I want to somehow, reconnect or do something to elevate the neshama, the soul of a loved one. So we have, it's on our website. I think it's, LasVegasCall.org. I believe a / Yahrzeit or Yahrzeit project, but it's on our website. And what we do is it's a consultation. There's free of charge. It's not a moneymaker. We're good at losing money at the kollel. It's a community service where you can meet or discuss with one of our rabbis, and we'll set up a tailor-made system that a person can feel, I am doing something to grow spiritually. I'll figure out a mitzvah that I can do, whether it be reciting the Kaddish, whether it be figuring out, well, when is the Yahrzeit, or what other things that I can do so that I can connect with the neshama. I can do something for the neshama of a loved one. So we offer that service to the community as a consultation to try to help tailor make something that will work, for your specific needs. So I certainly encourage, everyone to take advantage of that, to make the Yahrzeit that much more meaningful.
Amazing. So I think this concludes the recorded segment of today's